I'd always believed the desert was a place of clarity. Its vast openness, the silence, the unshakable permanence of the rocks, all of it had a way of simplifying things. That's why I chose Chiricahua National Monument for my trip. After months of sleepless nights and restless grief over my sister's death, I needed space to think. Or maybe I just needed to run. The campsite at Echo Canyon was remote, perched on the edge of a rugged expanse of towering rocks. Hoodoos, they were called, strange columns of stone carved by time and wind. They looked alive, like petrified giants frozen mid-step. As I parked my RV, their jagged silhouettes cast long shadows in the setting sun. I wanted peace, but the silence was different here. Heavy, unyielding. I told myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on me. That first night, I sat by the campfire, listening to the crackle of flames. The stars above were impossibly bright, the air crisp and cool. It should have been perfect, but the wind had a strange way of catching between the rocks, twisting into faint, hollow whispers. At first, I ignored it. The desert was full of odd sounds after all, but as the hours passed, the whispers grew louder. They seemed to shift with the breeze, curling around me like words I couldn't quite make out. When I strained to listen, they stopped. I shook my head, laughed nervously, and retreated to the RV. But even inside, with the door locked and the windows shut, I could hear them faintly. A soft, persistent sound, just on the edge of hearing. The next morning, I set out to explore Echo Canyon. The sun was warm on my back, and the air smelled of dust and sage. The trail wound through towering stone pillars that loomed like sentinels. As I walked, the sense of unease from the previous night began to fade. The desert had a way of swallowing your thoughts, forcing you to focus on the here and now. It wasn't until I reached a dry creek bed that the feeling returned. The stones here were different, pale and polished, as though smoothed by years of water. But the creek had long since dried up, leaving behind strange carvings etched into the rock. Some were circles, others jagged lines or spirals. They reminded me of petroglyphs, though their meaning was lost to me. I knelt to take a closer look, running my fingers over the grooves. That's when I heard it, a low, mournful wail carried on the wind. It started as a hum, barely audible, before rising into a sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. It wasn't human, but it wasn't entirely natural either. The sound seemed to come from the rocks themselves. As the wind shifted, it carried the wail through the canyon, where it echoed and twisted into something almost like a scream. I stood quickly, my pulse pounding. The desert wasn't supposed to feel alive. I told myself it was just the wind, a quirk of the landscape, and forced myself to keep walking. But as I left the creek bed behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that something unseen was watching me. That night, I sat in the RV, poring over my notes from the day. The carvings were unlike anything I'd seen before, but their meaning eluded me. The desert had always fascinated me, but I'd never felt so unwelcome. It was then I noticed the scratches. Long, deep gouges marred the side of the RV, as though something with claws had raked across the metal. My breath caught. I hadn't seen them when I parked, and I'd been alone all day. At least, I thought I had. The whispers started again, louder now, almost insistent. I stepped outside, scanning the darkness with my flashlight. The beam caught only empty rock and sand. And then I saw her. A figure stood at the edge of the dry creek bed, barely visible in the moonlight. She was draped in white, her long hair obscuring her face. Her shoulders shook, as if she were weeping. Every rational part of me screamed to go back inside, but my legs moved on their own, pulling me closer. "Are you okay?" I called out, my voice cracking. She didn't respond. She didn't move. As I stepped closer, my flashlight flickered, then went out entirely. When I clicked it back on, the woman was gone. I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty space where she'd been. The dry creek bed was silent, but the whispers didn't stop. I stumbled back to the RV, locked the door, and didn't sleep. The dreams started that night. I was standing in the creek bed, the woman in white beside me. Her face was still hidden, but her cries filled the air, raw and anguished. I tried to speak, but the ground gave way beneath me. Water surged up from the dry earth, cold and black, pulling me under. The woman's hands clutched at me, dragging me deeper as her whispers turned to screams. I woke, gasping for air, drenched in sweat. The RV was freezing, the heater dead. My journal lay open on the table, though I hadn't touched it since yesterday. On the page, scrawled in shaky handwriting, were the words, "Why didn't you save her?" I stared at the words, my stomach twisting. They weren't mine, but I knew what they meant. My sister's face flashed in my mind. Her smile, her laugh, the last voicemail she'd left me before the accident. The guilt I'd carried since her death tightened like a noose around my chest. By the third night, the woman's presence was impossible to ignore. She appeared at the edge of the campsite, closer each time. Her cries echoed through the canyon, growing louder, more desperate. The scratches on the RV deepened, the whispers turning into voices. My voice, my sister's voice, tangled and distorted. I knew I couldn't run from her, not anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and the bracelet my sister had given me, a small silver charm she'd bought for my birthday last year. It was the only thing of hers I'd kept. Clutching it tightly, I walked toward the creek bed. The whispers were deafening now, circling me like a storm. The air grew colder, each breath clouding in front of me. And then she appeared. The woman in white stood at the center of the creek bed, her hair blowing in an unfelt wind. Her face was no longer hidden. It was skeletal, her hollow eyes burning with sorrow and rage. Her mouth opened in a scream that shook the earth, splitting the air around me. I dropped to my knees, holding out the bracelet. "I'm sorry," I choked. "I'm sorry I couldn't save her." Her scream faltered and she froze. The air stilled, the whispers fading into silence. Slowly, she reached out, her hand brushing against the bracelet. A single tear fell from her hollow eye, and then she dissolved into the wind. The desert was silent again as I stumbled back to the RV, exhausted but somehow lighter. The scratches were gone, the heater working again, as though nothing had happened. But the bracelet was missing, left behind in the creek bed as a token of peace. As I drove away the next morning, I caught a glimpse of her in the rearview mirror, a fleeting figure in white, standing among the hoodoos, watching me go. And for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. The desert has a peculiar way of rearranging your thoughts. It strips them down to their bare components, exposing the raw nerves of your deepest fears and desires. That's what drew me to Death Valley, the promise of vast, unending silence where I could escape the noise of my crumbling life and the chaos in my mind. My name is Evan Thomas, and until recently, I lived a life tethered to dual monitors, endless code, and the persistent ping of urgent emails. But after my breakup with Mia, which felt like losing an anchor, I needed to disconnect. I needed to not think about her, about us, or about the migraines that started soon after, blurring the line between reality and illusion. I chose my 1980 S-era RV, which I affectionately called the Voyager, for this journey of solitude. As I drove into the heart of the park, the sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, the beauty of it almost mocking my inner turmoil. My first night, I set up camp near Furnace Creek. The area was deserted, a perfect match for my mood. I managed a small fire and sat under the stars, letting the silence envelop me. That's when the weirdness began. The old radio in the RV, mostly for show, crackled to life. I froze, listening to a voice that was eerily calm, its message looping, "Come to the crossroads, Evan. Come tonight." I rubbed my temples, chalking it up to stress-induced hallucinations. But as I tried to sleep, the voice from the radio haunted the edges of my dreams, a repetitive whisper in the vast darkness of my mind. The next day, I explored a bit, hiking up one of the less strenuous trails. That's when I saw him for the first time, the figure. He stood at a distance, a silhouette against the stark, barren landscape. Each time I blinked, he seemed to be closer, but whenever I approached, he vanished like a mirage. "Come to the crossroads, Evan. Come tonight." The voice was back, now a whisper carried by the wind. I shook my head, trying to clear the visions. By the time I returned to the Voyager, the sun was dipping below the horizon, and with it, my resolve. I decided to confront whatever was calling to me, to end these hallucinations once and for all. I drove the Voyager under the guidance of the fading light, heading towards what the old maps marked as a crossroads deep within the park. The landscape around me blurred, the sky darkening to a deep velvet as night took hold. The radio crackled again, the voice now a comfort in the enveloping darkness. "You're close, Evan. Don't turn back." I didn't. I couldn't. The wheels of the Voyager crunched over the gravel as I approached the crossroads. I parked and stepped out, the cool night air prickling my skin. There, at the center of the crossroads, stood the figure. Mr. Crossroads, my mind whispered. He was both old and ageless, his eyes a mirror of my own fears. "Why am I here?" I asked, my voice sounding small in the vast desert. "To confront what you've been avoiding, Evan. Your past, your pain, your reality," he replied, his voice echoing around us. I felt a surge of anger. "You're not real. You're just a figment of my broken mind." Am I? Or am I here to show you what's buried deep inside you, to help you face it so you can move forward? His questions hung in the air, heavier than the night itself. We stood there, at the crossroads, under the watchful eyes of the stars. He began to fade, becoming part of the night, part of the desert, part of me. Remember, Evan, healing begins when you accept the journey, no matter how hard it may be. When I woke up, it was morning. The sun was rising, casting a gentle warmth over the land. Mr. Crossroads was gone. The radio was silent. I sat there for a long time, processing the night, the words, the visions. Something within me had shifted, a subtle realignment of my thoughts and fears. I packed up my things, ready to leave Death Valley behind. but not the lessons I'd learned. As I drove out, the desert no longer seemed just a vast emptiness, but a place where I had faced myself, where I had started to mend. It was time to seek help, to manage my stress and hallucinations, to find my way back to a life where reality was something I could live with, not run from. The road ahead was uncertain, and I knew there would be more crossroads to come. But for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to meet them head on. The road had always been a place of reflection for me, a ribbon winding through my thoughts as much as through the landscapes. Since Lila's passing, these journeys in our old RV, which we affectionately named Wanderlust, became my solace and my penance. Lassen Volcanic National Park was to be a checkpoint, a name on the long list Lila and I had compiled during our twilight years together. Spring was supposed to have been kinder, but as I maneuvered Wanderlust through the snowy roads of Lassen, the flurries grew into a blizzard. I'd read about sudden weather changes here, but nothing quite prepares you for the isolation it brings. Setting up camp near Manzanita Lake, I tried to focus on the stillness of the white-covered pines and the soft blanket of snow that transformed the landscape into a winter wonderland. But the cold was biting, more so with Wanderlust's stubborn heater deciding it was time to retire. The first night, wrapped in layers of blankets, I listened to the wind howl like a gathering of spirits outside. In the morning, my breath visible in the frigid air, I discovered my previous day's tracks to the lake had been erased and replaced. The new set were larger, with a stride longer than any human's. Curiosity piqued. I followed the tracks until they vanished into the thicket. Each night I saw them, blue lights flickering in the distance across the frozen lake. They danced like fireflies trapped in winter's grip. I rationalized them as a trick of the eye, refracted moonlight perhaps, but my heart leaned towards something more, something otherworldly. On the third day, trapped by another surge of snow and haunted by the vision of those lights, I decided to confront the mystery head-on. Bundling up, I trekked towards the source, my steps muffled by the fresh snow. The closer I got, the clearer the lights became, a soft, mournful blue that pulsed in the rhythm of a sad heart. As I reached the edge of a clearing, I saw them. Figures enveloped in an ethereal glow, their forms shimmering against the stark white of the snow. They did not notice me at first. The figures were reenacting some desperate measure, gathering invisible wood, their motions repetitive and sorrowful. It was then I realized they were the remnants of a lost expedition, souls trapped in their last moments, forever trying to stave off the cold that had claimed their lives. My heart ached with a widower's grief, understanding all too well the pain of being caught in an endless loop of sorrow. I approached, my voice gentle, breaking the eerie silence. "I'm here to help," I murmured, though I wasn't sure they could hear me. As if my words were a spell, the figures paused, turning towards me. Their eyes were hollow with despair, their faces gaunt, shaped by the merciless cold. One of them, a man wearing a tattered expedition coat, stepped forward. His voice was a whisper, carried by the wind. "Help us warm. Help us leave." I nodded, unsure how to assist but driven by a resolve to try. I returned to Wanderlust, gathering blankets, an unopened bottle of whiskey, and my emergency food supplies. Setting up a makeshift campfire back in the clearing, I laid out the blankets around it and placed the food and whiskey nearby. Night had fallen by the time I finished, and the temperature dropped further. I lit the fire, the flames casting a warm glow. The spirits watched, their blue light mingling with the fire's orange. One by one, they approached, drawn to the warmth they had not felt in decades. They did not eat, nor did they drink, but they gathered around the fire, their blue light slowly fading into a peaceful white. The man in the expedition coat spoke again, his voice stronger now. "You've given us what we yearned for, warmth and remembrance." As the fire died down, so did their light. By the time the first rays of dawn touched the snowy clearing, they were gone. In their place, lying in the snow near where the fire had been, was a small, leather-bound journal. I picked it up, the leather cold and stiff. The journal was filled with entries from the expedition leader, detailing their journey and eventual demise. Holding the journal close, I felt a bridge form between the past and present, a connection through shared humanity and compassion. I knew then what I needed to do. My journey wasn't just about seeing new places or escaping the pain of my loss. It was about understanding and connecting, about finding stories that needed to be told. As I drove away from Lassen, leaving the spirits and the cold behind, I planned my next destination. There were more parks to visit, more echoes of the past to listen to, and more forgotten stories to revive. Wanderlust was more than just a vehicle. It was a vessel carrying me through grief, to healing, and perhaps in time to a new beginning. The story of the Frost of the Forgotten would be my first chapter. I always said I wasn't afraid of the dark. That's what made me different from the countless other YouTubers chasing clicks and attention. I wanted to find the stories that made people question what they believed in. Ghosts, cryptids, legends, I wanted it all. And Shenandoah National Park, with its dense Appalachian forests and eerie local myths, seemed like the perfect place for my next series. The legend I was chasing this time, the faceless ones. Shadowy figures, human-shaped but smooth and featureless, said to roam the deep woods at night. The locals believed they lured travelers off the trails into places no one returned from. The stories sounded like old-fashioned warnings to keep kids from wandering too far. But the footage, that would make people watch. I arrived late in the afternoon, the autumn sun hanging low in the sky as I pulled my RV into a remote campground near Dark Hollow Falls. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, the trees close enough that their branches tangled overhead. The campground was empty, perfect for what I needed. No nosy campers ruining my shots. The first evening was uneventful. I set up my equipment, planned my hikes for the next day, and spent the night editing footage from a previous trip. The forest was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. By midnight, I was sitting outside under a blanket of stars, the campfire crackling softly. It felt peaceful. Then I heard the first knock. It wasn't loud, just a faint tapping sound coming from the trees. 3 knocks, spaced evenly, like someone rapping on wood. I froze, the hairs on my arms standing on end. I scanned the forest with my flashlight, but there was nothing, just rows of trees vanishing into darkness. Probably an animal, I muttered, forcing a laugh. But I stayed by the fire a little longer that night. The next morning, I set out with my drone to film some aerial footage of the park. The canopy of red and gold leaves looked stunning against the deep green of the mountains. As I flew the drone over a particularly dense patch of forest, the feed on my monitor began to glitch. Static crackled across the screen, and the drone's GPS lost its signal. Before I could bring it back, the drone let out an eerie whine and crashed into the woods. I cursed, shouldering my gear and hiking toward its last location. The trees were denser here, their branches twisting like claws. I followed the drone's tracking beacon to a clearing. The grass in the center was flattened, forming a perfect circle. Around the edge of the clearing stood the rocks, arranged upright like ancient markers. My drone lay in the middle, completely intact. Relief flooded through me, but as I stepped into the clearing, the forest went silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. It was as if the world had hit pause. I grabbed the drone and backed out of the clearing as quickly as I could, my chest tight with unease. I didn't know what I'd just walked into, but I didn't want to stick around to find out. That night, I reviewed the footage. Most of it was normal. Aerial views of the park, sweeping shots of the mountains. But as the drone flew over the clearing, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were figures, tall, shadowy shapes at the edge of the clearing. They weren't visible at first, but as the drone hovered, they appeared one by one, blending into the tree line like they were part of it. They had no faces, just smooth, blank surfaces where their features should have been. I rewound the footage, leaning closer to the screen. The figures didn't move. They just stood there, watching. A sudden knock on the RV door made me jump. I whipped around, my heart pounding. It was the same pattern as before. 3 knocks, evenly spaced. I grabbed my flashlight and yanked the door open, expecting to find an animal or a prankster. But the campsite was empty. Just the wind in the trees, or so I told myself. I locked the door that night. I woke around 2 a.m. to a tapping sound, this time on the RV window. My blood turned cold. The sound moved, circling the RV from one window to the next. Tap, tap, tap. I peeked through the curtains, my breath caught in my throat. One of them was standing just outside, its featureless face tilted toward me. Its body was impossibly tall, its arms too long, its fingers blackened like burnt wood. It didn't move. It just stood there. Another knock came from the back of the RV, then another from the other side. I was surrounded. I backed away, my mind racing. My cameras. I needed proof. I fumbled for my equipment, but when I turned it on, the screen filled with static. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. Shadows shifted across the windows and my chest tightened with panic. "Leave me alone," I shouted, but my voice came out weak, trembling. The knocking stopped. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next day, I debated leaving the park. My footage wasn't great, but I could edit it into something passable. Yet, part of me refused to give up. If these things were real, I needed more proof. I spent the day hiking and setting up more cameras, determined to capture something definitive. As the sun set, the whispers began. They came from the woods, faint at first, but growing louder as darkness fell. They sounded like my own voice, calling my name. "Chris." It wasn't an echo. The tone was wrong, distorted, mocking. I ran back to the RV, slamming the door behind me, but the whispers followed, growing louder until they seemed to come from inside the RV itself. Then I heard laughter. Not mine. Desperation forced me to think back to a local legend I'd read online. The story claimed that salt and fire could ward off the faceless ones. I tore through my supplies, finding a small container of salt and a bundle of sage I'd brought for aesthetic shots. I spread a ring of salt around the RV and lit the sage, letting the smoke billow into the night. The whispers faded, and for a moment, I felt safe. But then the knocking returned, louder this time, rattling the walls of the RV. They weren't gone. They were angry. Sometime after midnight, the RV's lights flickered and died. I fumbled in the dark, my heart pounding. A cold draft swept through the space, and I realized the door was open. I hadn't touched it. One of them was inside. It stood at the foot of the bed, its blank face tilted as though studying me. My voice caught in my throat as I scrambled backward. The air around it felt heavy, suffocating, and when it raised a hand, I felt an icy force press against my chest. I couldn't move. My mind raced, filled with flashes of the clearing, the rocks, the circle. In a final act of desperation, I grabbed the flare gun from under the bed and fired. The room filled with a blinding red light, and the creature let out a horrible, guttural sound before vanishing. The whispers stopped. At dawn, I didn't pack. I didn't even care about the cameras I'd left in the woods. I started the RV and drove out of the park, not stopping until I was miles away. I deleted the footage that morning, erasing every trace of the faceless ones. My YouTube channel went dark. I couldn't explain what I'd seen, and I didn't want to try. But even now, as I sit in my apartment, I can't shake the feeling that they followed me. Sometimes I hear faint knocking on my windows, even though I'm 3 floors up. And at night, when the lights are off, I catch glimpses of shadows that don't belong. They're still watching, waiting, and I don't know why. The gas station was the last sign of civilization before the road wound into the Ouachita National Forest. I parked my RV under the single dim light by the pump and stepped out, stretching my legs. The air smelled like rain on dry dirt. As I filled the tank, the elderly attendant hobbled over, leaning on a wooden cane. His face was a map of creases, his eyes sharp beneath a worn cap. "You heading into the forest?" he asked. "Yep," I said, trying to sound upbeat. "A week of peace and quiet." The old man frowned. "You got a map?" "GPS should do the trick." He shook his head. "GPS don't work well up there. And don't camp on the ridge. They don't like visitors." I hesitated. "They?" His lips thinned and he waved me off, muttering something about city folks. I laughed it off as superstition, paid for the gas, and hit the road, but as the forest swallowed the pavement, his words lingered. The ridge was perfect, or at least it looked perfect at first. My campsite was perched on the edge of a steep drop, offering a sweeping view of the Ouachita Mountains. A sea of green stretched into the horizon, where the setting sun painted the trees in gold and amber. I set up quickly. The RV was stocked, the fire pit ready, and I had a week of hiking, fishing, and journaling to look forward to. This trip was my way of resetting. The divorce had left me hollow, unsure of who I was without Emily. Everyone said time would heal, but 3 months of silence had done nothing. Maybe here, surrounded by nature, I could figure it out. That first night, I sat by the fire with a whiskey in hand, the stars above me brighter than I'd seen in years. For the first time in months, I felt okay. But as the fire burned down to embers, the silence pressed in, thick and heavy. There were no crickets, no rustling leaves, just stillness. Then, far in the distance, a branch snapped. The next morning, I decided to explore. I'd marked a nearby lake on my map, so I packed some snacks, grabbed my journal, and headed out. The trail was overgrown but manageable, winding through dense forest. The trees seemed taller here, their branches clawing at the sky. About halfway to the lake, I started noticing them, small piles of rocks and sticks arranged in deliberate patterns. Circles, triangles, shapes I didn't recognize. At first, I thought they were cairns left by other hikers, but these felt wrong, like they weren't meant to guide anyone but to warn them. I brushed it off and kept going, but when I reached the lake, something stopped me cold. In the damp earth along the trail, someone had written my name. Luke. The letters were jagged, like they'd been carved with a stick. I stared at it for a long time. Rationally, I told myself it had to be a coincidence. Luke wasn't an uncommon name. Maybe another hiker with the same name had passed through. But as I turned back toward camp, the forest felt different. The trees loomed closer, their shadows stretching longer. That night, I dreamed of him. I was standing at the ridge, staring out at the mountains, when a shadow appeared at the edge of my vision. Tall and gaunt, it wore a wide-brimmed hat that cast its face in darkness. It didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, watching me. When I woke, the RV was freezing. The heater had cut out, and the overhead lights flickered weakly. I sat up, disoriented, and noticed my journal lying open on the table. I was sure I'd left it in my backpack. Pages fluttered as a cold draft swept through the RV, though all the windows were shut. Outside, the forest was silent again. By the third day, the little things were adding up. Scratches appeared on the RV's side, long and jagged, like something with claws had dragged them across the metal. Inside, items kept moving. My flashlight ended up under the bed, my boots were on the wrong side of the RV, and my phone vanished completely. And then there was the shadow. That night, as I sat by the fire, I saw it for the first time. A tall figure stood on the far side of the ridge, silhouetted against the moonlight. My heart froze. It wore the same wide-brimmed hat from my dream. Its limbs were impossibly long, its stance rigid. I blinked, and it was gone. Just your imagination, I muttered to myself. Stress, isolation, that's all. But I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt it watching me. I woke to whispers. Faint, indistinct murmurs that seemed to come from everywhere at once. My name repeated over and over in voices that weren't mine. I sat up in bed, every nerve on edge. The RV's interior light flickered again, and the heater sputtered to life, then cut out. The whispers grew louder, like a storm brewing just outside the walls. And then I saw it. The Hat Man was inside the RV. He stood at the foot of my bed, his shadowy form filling the narrow space. His hat nearly brushed the ceiling, and though his face was hidden, I felt his gaze, cold and piercing. My chest tightened as I realized I couldn't move. My limbs were frozen, pinned to the bed as if by some invisible force. "Why are you here?" I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The Hat Man didn't speak. He tilted his head as though studying me, and then slowly reached out with a long, shadowy hand. The light flickered one last time, and he vanished. I couldn't stay another night. I packed as quickly as I could, my hands trembling, and started the RV's engine. It sputtered, stalled, and died. I cursed, trying again and again, but the vehicle wouldn't start. I was trapped. As the sun set, I decided to make a run for it. I grabbed my flashlight, a bottle of water, and my journal, the only things I could carry, and headed down the trail, praying I'd remember the way back to the road. The forest was alive now, filled with the crunch of leaves and the snap of branches. I glanced over my shoulder and saw him again. Closer this time. The Hat Man moved with unnatural fluidity, his limbs bending in ways they shouldn't. His whispers filled the air, blending with the sound of my own ragged breathing. I tripped and fell into a clearing, the wind knocked from my lungs. The Hat Man stood above me, his form blocking the stars. Voices filled my head, mocking, accusing, dredging up every mistake I'd made. My failed marriage, the lies I'd told myself, the loneliness I couldn't escape. "You don't belong here," the voices said, echoing in my mind. Desperate, I pulled out my journal and hurled it at him. "I'm sorry," I screamed, the words raw and guttural. "I'm sorry for everything." The Hat Man recoiled, his shadowy form flickering like smoke. And then he was gone. The forest fell. I woke to sunlight filtering through the trees. My RV was parked nearby as if it had been waiting for me. There were no scratches, no flickering lights, no sign of the nightmare I'd endured. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't truly escaped. Even now, weeks later, I see him sometimes. A shadow in my peripheral vision. A flicker of movement when I glance away. The Hat Man is still watching. And I don't know if he'll ever leave. I always thought the Pine Barrens were just trees and sand and the faint smell of swamp water. Nothing sinister, nothing special. I'd grown up on stories about the Jersey Devil, but they were campfire tales, nothing to take seriously. But now, as I sit in the flickering light of my broken RV, scratching claw marks gouged into the metal, I know better. It started 3 days ago. The Pine Barrens seemed like the perfect place to clear my head. I'd left everything behind. My suffocating office job, the tiny apartment that felt like a prison, and the memories of the breakup that had hollowed me out. I'd bought an old RV, slapped a camera around my neck, and hit the road. When I arrived, the forest stretched endlessly in every direction, the pines rising like dark spires against the sky. I parked the RV on a sandy clearing just off a dirt road, far from any hiking trails. It was the isolation I'd been craving, a place to breathe. The first day was calm, peaceful even. I spent the afternoon hiking with my camera, snapping shots of gnarled trees and the odd deer trail. The quiet was unlike anything I'd experienced before. Not just the absence of traffic or city noise, there were no bird calls, no rustling leaves, just a dense, heavy silence. I convinced myself it was natural, but looking back, I should have left the moment I noticed the quiet. The trouble started that night. I was lying in bed, scrolling through the day's photos on my camera when I heard it. A long, low scream. It wasn't a fox or an owl. I knew those sounds. This was guttural, something between a growl and a wail, as if it came from deep in the throat of something massive. I froze, holding my breath, listening. A heavy thud followed, like something large stomping through the sand just outside the RV. I sat up, heart pounding, and turned off the lights. My hand hovered over the curtain by the window. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to know what was out there. The footsteps moved on, fading into the trees. I stayed awake for hours, listening until exhaustion finally pulled me under. The next morning, I stepped outside cautiously, my camera slung around my neck. At first glance, everything seemed normal. Just the sandy clearing, the RV, and a thin layer of mist clinging to the ground. Then I saw the tracks. Hoof prints. They were massive, at least twice the size of any deer's, with deep impressions that suggested whatever made them was heavy. They circled my RV in a loose loop before disappearing into the woods. Probably just a wild horse, I said aloud, trying to convince myself. But even as the words left my mouth, I didn't believe them. I spent the day exploring deeper into the barrens, trying to shake the unease that had settled over me. My camera started acting up, refusing to focus properly. When it did take a picture, the images came out distorted, with strange smudges and shadows that didn't make sense. I was almost glad for the distraction. Almost. By the time I made it back to the RV, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the sand. I set up a small fire and tried to enjoy the evening, but the quiet was unnerving. The trees seemed to lean in closer, their twisted branches reaching toward me. That night, the footsteps came again. This time they were slower, more deliberate. I lay motionless in the dark, clutching a flashlight. The sound circled the RV, heavy and plodding, as if the thing outside was pacing. Then came the scratching. It started low, near the bottom of the door, a slow, deliberate scrape of claws against metal. I bolted upright, my breath caught in my throat. The scratching moved higher, closer to the window, and I swore I heard breathing. Shallow, wet breaths, inches away from where I sat. I didn't dare move. The sound stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. I sat there until dawn, gripping the flashlight like a lifeline. The next morning, I found the scratches. Deep gouges ran down the side of the RV, their edges jagged as if made by claws. Whatever had done this wasn't playing games. It was testing me, letting me know I was being watched. I wanted to leave. Hell, I should have, but I convinced myself I was overreacting. I'd come here to escape, to clear my head, and I wasn't going to let a few creepy noises ruin that. That afternoon, I found the cabin. It was deep in the woods, hidden behind a thick wall of brush. The roof had caved in, and the walls were warped with age. I should have turned back, but something about it drew me in. Inside, the air was damp and heavy. Broken furniture lay scattered across the floor, and the remains of a stone fireplace jutted out of one wall. But what caught my attention were the carvings. They covered every surface, walls, floors, even the ceiling. Symbols I didn't recognize, spirals and jagged lines etched deep into the wood. And words, scratched hastily, repeated over and over. It feeds on fear. In the corner, I found a journal, its leather cover cracked and brittle. The entries were frantic, written in a shaky hand. The devil watches me at night. I hear it calling my name. Fire keeps it away. My blood ran cold. That night, the thing outside wasn't shy. It didn't pace. It didn't scratch. It slammed into the RV with enough force to shake it, the sound reverberating like a thunderclap. I grabbed the flashlight and stood in the center of the RV, heart pounding, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The walls rattled again, and I heard the distinct sound of something clawing at the roof. Then came the voice. "Mark." It was low and guttural, spoken slowly, almost a growl. "Mark." My legs gave out, and I sank to the floor, shaken. The voice was inside my head, but it was outside too, echoing through the night. The journal's words burned in my mind. Fire. I needed fire. My hands moved on instinct, grabbing the propane canister from the small stove. I rigged it with a lighter and stood near the door, my makeshift flamethrower trembling in my grasp. The voice came again, louder this time. "Mark, come outside." The walls groaned as something heavy pressed against them, and I knew the RV wouldn't hold much longer. I threw the door open and stepped into the night, my heart pounding like a war drum. The clearing was bathed in moonlight, and for a moment it seemed empty. Then I saw it. The creature was massive, its hunched form towering above me. It had the body of a man, but twisted, covered in thick, matted fur. Its legs ended in massive hooves, and its eyes glowed a sickening red. The Jersey Devil. It stared at me, its head tilting unnaturally as if studying me. Then it lunged. I didn't think, I just fired. The stream of flame roared to life, lighting up the clearing. The creature let out an ear-splitting screech, retreating into the shadows as the fire burned in its path. I kept the flame going, backing toward the RV, my hands shaking violently. The creature screamed again, the sound fading as it disappeared into the trees. By morning, I was gone. The RV was damaged but still functional, and I didn't look back as I drove out of the Pine Barrens. The marks on the RV, the journal, the photos on my camera, proof of what I'd seen, were enough to keep me away forever. But even now, as I write this, I still hear its voice in my dreams. Mark. I don't believe in ghosts. Let's start there. I'm not some superstitious thrill-seeker looking for a cheap scare. I'm a storyteller. I've spent years as a journalist chasing facts, and now, as a full-time vlogger, I chase compelling stories. That's what brought me and my brother Caleb to Antelope Canyon in Arizona, a place of breathtaking sandstone formations, whispering winds, and legends as old as time. I wanted something unique for my channel. I got far more than I bargained for. It began with an idea, a road trip to lesser-known parts of Antelope Canyon, capturing stunning visuals and digging into Navajo folklore. Caleb wasn't thrilled about joining me. He's the quieter sibling, happier behind his camera than in front of it. But we hadn't spent much time together since Mom and Dad's divorce, so I talked him into it. I figured the trip would be good for both of us. We hired a guide named Lila, a Navajo woman with a sharp gaze and a cautious demeanor. She wasn't excited about our destination. "This section of the canyon, locals don't go there," she said, adjusting the brim of her hat. "It's sacred. People who disturb it, things don't always go well for them." Her tone made Caleb shift uncomfortably, but I smiled and brushed it off. "I'm not here to disturb anything. I just want to tell the story." Lila didn't look convinced, but she nodded. "Just follow my rules. No shouting, no taking anything, and if you see something strange, don't acknowledge it." I should have listened. The first few hours were perfect. The sunlight poured into the narrow canyon, painting the sandstone walls in reds, oranges, and purples. Caleb's camera clicked away as I narrated into mine. Lila stayed a few steps ahead, her footsteps echoing softly. "This is stunning," I said, glancing at Caleb. "You're getting this, right?" He nodded but didn't smile. He'd been quiet since we arrived, more so than usual. I chalked it up to nerves. He wasn't used to hiking in tight spaces like this. The walls pressed close, cool and smooth under my fingers. That's when the first strange thing happened. We'd paused to set up a shot when Caleb called out, "Hey, Emma, look at this." I walked over to where he was pointing. High on the canyon wall, almost 15 feet up, were handprints. "How'd those get up there?" Caleb muttered, stepping back to snap a photo. Lila's voice cut through the silence. "Leave them. They're just... leave them," she repeated sharply. Her eyes scanned the walls, her fingers gripping the strap of her pack. I thought she was being dramatic, but something about her tone silenced my protest. We kept walking, but the air felt heavier after that. By late afternoon, we were deeper in the canyon, and my camera started acting up. The screen flickered, lines of static cutting across the frame. "What's wrong with it?" Caleb asked, glancing over. "No idea." I tapped the side, but the screen only grew worse, splitting into jagged black and white patterns. I groaned. "Great. Expensive paperweight." "Maybe it's the light," Caleb offered, though he sounded unconvinced. Lila stopped ahead of us. "We need to turn back soon," she said. "It gets dangerous after dark." "But we're not done," I argued. "There's still so much to film." She didn't respond, just adjusted her pack and kept walking. Frustrated, I gestured for Caleb to keep filming while I fiddled with the camera, but the glitching continued. Then the whispers began. At first, I thought it was the wind, a soft, hollow sound that rose and fell in waves. But it didn't take long to realize it wasn't just random noise. The whispers were rhythmic, deliberate, threading through the canyon like a chant. I stopped mid-step, tilting my head to listen. "Do you hear that?" I asked. Caleb nodded slowly. "It's weird, like voices." Lila froze. "Don't listen to it," she said sharply, her voice low. "Keep walking." "But..." "Walk." Her tone left no room for argument, so we kept moving, though my pulse hammered in my chest. The whispers didn't stop. They seemed to grow louder, as if the canyon itself was speaking, calling our names, twisting the wind into words. Things got worse after Caleb's drone went down. He'd launched it to capture an overhead view of the canyon, its sleek black form buzzing upward. But minutes later, the signal cut out. The drone plummeted into a narrow crevice far out of reach. "Seriously?" Caleb groaned, peering over the edge. "That thing cost a fortune." "We can come back for it later," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. The path had grown increasingly maze-like, the walls tighter and more jagged. "No," Caleb said. "I'm not leaving it." Lila sighed heavily. "It's gone. You won't find it." "Why not?" Caleb snapped. "It's right there." She didn't answer, just turned away, muttering something in Navajo under her breath. Caleb shot me a look, frustration and unease battling on his face. The sun was slipping behind the canyon walls when Caleb changed. It started subtly. He grew agitated, snapping at me over small things. His eyes darted to shadows, and his breathing quickened. When we passed a small pool of water, I caught him staring at his reflection with a strange intensity. "Caleb?" I asked. He jerked away, rubbing his temples. "I'm fine, just tired." Lila stopped again, her face grim. "We're leaving now." "What's your deal?" Caleb demanded. "Why are you so paranoid?" She ignored him, her eyes scanning the narrowing path. That's when the whispers returned, louder now, echoing through the canyon like 1,000 unseen mouths. And then I saw the figure. It stood just beyond the bend, a shape half hidden in the shadows. It was human-like, but wrong. Its arms were too long, its posture too stiff. Its face was obscured, but I could feel its eyes, cold and unblinking, locked on me. "Did you see that?" I whispered, clutching Caleb's arm. He didn't respond. When I looked at him, his face was pale, his lips trembling. "Emma, it looks like me." "What?" It looks like me," he shouted, pointing toward the figure. There was nothing there. The panic set in fast. Caleb was unraveling, his fear twisting into anger. He yelled at Lila, accusing her of leading us into danger. He yelled at me for dragging him along, and all the while the whispers grew louder, mocking, taunting. Lila grabbed my arm. "It's the Chindi," she said, her voice urgent. "A spirit. It feeds on fear and anger. We have to leave now." "How do we stop it?" I asked, my own voice shaking. "We can't stop it. But we can escape, if you let go of what you've taken." I stared at her, confused. "What are you talking about?" "The camera," she said, "the drone. Anything that doesn't belong here, leave it." "No," I said instinctively. "I need that footage." Lila's eyes burned into mine. "You need to survive." Before I could argue, Caleb bolted. He ran toward the crevice, shouting about the drone, his voice echoing chaotically. I chased after him, calling his name, but the canyon twisted around me, the walls pressing closer, the shadows deeper. I found him standing at the edge of the crevice, staring down. "Caleb," I said, my voice trembling, "come back." He turned slowly, his face blank, his eyes hollow. "I hear it," he said. "It wants me to come down." "No!" I lunged forward, grabbing his arm. He fought me, his strength unnaturally strong, but Lila appeared beside me, pulling him back. "You have to let go," she shouted. "Destroy what you've taken." I hesitated, clutching the camera in my hands. The whispers surged, deafening, as the shadowy figure emerged from the crevice, its distorted form crawling toward us. With a cry, I hurled the camera against the rock. It shattered into pieces, and the whispers stopped. The silence was overwhelming. Caleb collapsed to the ground, trembling as the figure dissolved into the shadows. Lila knelt beside him, murmuring in Navajo, her voice steady and soothing. We left the canyon in the dark, navigating by Lila's knowledge alone. When we finally reached the RV, I felt a wave of relief so intense it nearly knocked me over. But as we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched. Back at home, I uploaded what little footage remained from my phone. The video was raw, disjointed, but compelling. It wasn't until the final frame that I noticed it, the shadow. A flicker in the background, its eyes glinting like cold fire. Even now I can feel it watching. I drove into the campground just before dusk, my RV rattling slightly on the uneven gravel road. Shasta Lake stretched out to my left, its surface glassy and still, catching the dying light like a mirror. It was beautiful in a way that made my chest ache, a beauty I used to share with her. It had been 3 years since I lost Natalie, 3 years since the lake swallowed her. Not this lake, but one like it. Too much wine, a late-night swim, and a moment of carelessness. I should have stopped her. That guilt was the reason I was here, in this remote corner of Northern California, far from everyone I knew. I needed space to think, to process, to let go. At least, that's what I told myself. Truthfully, I wasn't sure what I was looking for. The first night passed quietly. I set up camp by the shore, close enough to hear the water lapping gently against the rocks. The air was crisp, the sky clear and dotted with stars. It should have been peaceful, but I couldn't shake a sense of unease. When I lay down to sleep, I dreamed of her, Natalie, standing in the water, her hair wet and clinging to her face. She smiled at me, the same radiant smile I fell in love with, but her eyes looked strange, too wide, too dark. "Come in," she whispered, her voice soft and melodic. I woke with a start, heart pounding, the sound of her voice lingering in my ears. The next day, I spent hours sketching by the lake. The stillness unnerved me. The water was so calm it reflected the sky like a pane of glass. No ripples, no movement, just an unnatural quiet that seemed to press down on me. I tried to focus on the landscape, capturing the interplay of light and shadow, but my sketches kept shifting. No matter how hard I concentrated, the shapes took on a different form. Her form. By late afternoon, I needed a break. I wandered up the trail toward the main campground, hoping to see someone, anyone, to break the isolation. The first campsite was abandoned, the fire pit cold and scattered with half-burned logs. The second was the same. When I reached the third, a man was packing up his gear, his movements hurried and frantic. "Hey," I called, raising a hand, "leaving already." He looked at me, his face pale and drawn. "You should leave too," he said. "This place isn't right." Before I could ask what he meant, he threw his pack into the bed of his truck and drove off, the tires kicking up a cloud of dust. That night, I heard the whispers. I was sitting by the fire, watching the flames dance, when the sound drifted over the water. Faint and melodic, like a lullaby sung from a great distance. I froze, straining to listen. The whispers grew louder, weaving together into a hauntingly beautiful song. "Ryan." I stiffened. It wasn't just a song, it was my name. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped toward the shore. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing the empty expanse of water. But then, far out in the lake, I saw her, a figure swimming, her long hair trailing behind her like a dark veil. "Natalie?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The figure stopped, turning slowly to face me. Even from a distance, I could see her smile. "Come in," she called, her voice carrying over the water. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. By the time I picked it up, she was gone. The next morning, I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Exhaustion, grief, an overactive imagination. It had to be one of those. But deep down, I wasn't convinced. When I opened my sketch pad, I found a drawing I didn't remember making. It was Natalie, standing in the lake, her hand outstretched. The lines were precise, detailed, as though I'd spent hours on it. But I hadn't. By the third night, the song was everywhere. I tried to block it out, covering my ears and retreating into the RV, but the melody seeped through the walls, wrapping around me like a cocoon. I sat at the table, gripping my sketch pad, when the temperature dropped suddenly. My breath fogged in the air and the hair on my arms stood on end. "Ryan?" The voice was behind me now, soft and familiar. I turned slowly, and there she was. Natalie stood in the doorway, dripping wet, her hair plastered to her face. She looked just as I remembered her, but something was wrong. Her skin had a pale bluish tint, and her eyes were wide and unblinking. "Come with me," she whispered, her lips curling into a smile. My mind screamed to run, but my body wouldn't move. She stepped closer, her wet footprints staining the floor. "It's okay," she said, her voice soothing. "We'll be together again." Her hand reached for mine, cold and clammy, and I felt myself leaning forward, drawn to her. But then I saw it, her reflection in the window. It wasn't Natalie. The figure in the glass was monstrous, its skin translucent, revealing the skeletal structure beneath. Its hair writhed like seaweed, and its eyes glowed with a predatory light. I wrenched my hand away, stumbling back. The creature's face twisted in rage, and it let out a guttural scream that shook the RV. I don't remember how I made it through the night. I sat huddled in the corner, clutching a can of pepper spray like it was a weapon. The song faded with the first light of dawn, but its echo lingered in my ears. I knew I couldn't stay. I packed up quickly, my hands shaking as I shoved supplies into the RV. When I stepped outside, the lake was perfectly still, its surface smooth as glass, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. She was standing at the edge of the lake, her figure reflected in the water, smiling. Months later, I still hear the song. It creeps into my dreams, pulling me back to that place, back to her. I haven't painted since the trip, and I avoid water whenever I can. But sometimes when I close my eyes, I see her reflection in the glass, waiting for me to slip. The hum of the RV engine faded into the background as I parked in a secluded corner of Devil's Den State Park. I leaned back in the driver's seat, looking out over the densely wooded area. The stillness was exactly what I needed. Solitude, space to think, and no reminders of the divorce waiting for me back in Little Rock. This trip wasn't just for my mental health, though. I'd come here for a story. Devil's Den had a reputation. People disappearing, UFO sightings, conspiracy theories that made for great clickbait. My plan was to spend a few days exploring, collect enough material to write a scathing takedown of the supernatural tourism industry, and head home with both a clearer head and a fat freelance paycheck. I stepped out of the RV, stretching as I took in the quiet. No campers, no kids yelling, no sounds at all except the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. Perfect. By dusk, I'd set up camp. A modest fire crackled in the pit as I sat back with my notebook, jotting down impressions. Strange how quiet it was here. No bird calls or crickets, just an unsettling stillness that made me feel like I'd walked into a tomb. The RV's lights flickered, drawing my attention. I frowned. I'd checked everything before leaving and the batteries were fully charged. Still, I went inside to investigate. That's when the power cut out entirely. No lights, no heater, not even the faint hum of the fridge. Great, I muttered, grabbing my flashlight. After 30 minutes of poking around, I gave up. Nothing I tried worked, and with no cell service this deep into the park, I was stuck. First thing tomorrow, I told myself, I'll head to the ranger station. But deep down, I wasn't sure I wanted to wait that long. That night, the knocking started. I was sitting in the dark RV, flipping through my notes by flashlight, when I heard it. 3 knocks on the side of the vehicle. At first, I thought it was a branch, or maybe an animal, but it came again, deliberate and rhythmic. Knock, knock, knock. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside. Hello? Nothing. Just the faint glow of the moon filtering through the trees. The air was colder than I remembered, the kind of chill that seeps into your bones. I circled the RV, but there was no sign of anyone, or anything. Back inside, I locked the door and tried to laugh it off. Just the wind, I told myself. but I didn't believe it. The next day, I decided to hike the Devil's Den Trail, a short loop, easy enough to clear in a couple of hours. I needed something to take my mind off the night before. The trail was eerie in its silence. Even in daylight, the shadows seemed to stretch farther than they should, pooling in the crevices of the rock formations. I stopped several times to snap photos, but each picture came out darker than expected, as though the shadows were swallowing the light. By the time I got back to the RV, the sun was already dipping below the horizon. I checked my watch. 4 hours had passed, though the loop shouldn't have taken more than one. "That's not possible," I muttered, staring at the numbers. I felt like I'd stepped into a time warp. That night, the knocking returned, louder this time. Knock, knock, knock. I ignored it, curling deeper into my sleeping bag. But then it came again. On the roof this time. I bolted upright, my breath fogging in the freezing air. "Ethan!" I froze. It was a voice, faint and distant, coming from outside. My name, whispered in a tone so familiar it sent shivers down my spine. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The voice came again, louder this time. "Ethan, come outside!" Against every instinct, I grabbed the flashlight and yanked open the door. The clearing was empty, the trees swaying gently in the wind. But as I scanned the area, my light caught something. A shadow moving against the trunk of a tree. It wasn't the wind. The shadow had a shape, a person. I backed into the RV, slamming the door shut. The next morning, I wasn't alone. I met her on the trail, a woman, mid-40s, with wiry black hair tied into a ponytail. She introduced herself as Claire, a camper like me, though her pack looked suspiciously empty. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, smirking. "Rough night," I muttered, not wanting to share too much. She nodded, her expression darkening. "You should leave before dark. This place, it doesn't like people staying too long." I laughed. "Let me guess, local ghost stories?" Claire didn't laugh. She just stared at me for a long moment before saying, "It's not the stories that'll get you, it's the shadows." Then she walked off, disappearing down the trail before I could ask her what she meant. That night, the shadows came inside. It started as movement out of the corner of my eye, a flicker, there and gone before I could focus. Then the flickers became shapes. They darted along the walls, impossible forms that moved even when the RV was still. "Ethan," a voice whispered, this time from inside. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I scanned the room. Nothing. "Ethan?" The voice was behind me now, and when I turned I saw it. A figure, barely more than a silhouette, standing at the far end of the RV. Its edges were jagged, like smoke trying to hold a human shape. I stumbled back, crashing into the cabinets. The figure didn't move, but it didn't have to. The air around it felt suffocating, like all the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. "You don't belong here," it said, though the voice didn't come from its mouth. It came from everywhere. I didn't sleep. At dawn, I packed my things and started driving toward the ranger station, but the road twisted in ways it shouldn't have. No matter how far I drove, the trees stretched on endlessly, their gnarled branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sun. My GPS was useless, the signal blinking in and out. Hours passed. I should have reached the station by now, but the forest just kept going. Then I saw her, Claire, standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, the RV skidding to a halt. She approached the window, her face pale and gaunt. "You can't leave," she said, "not while they're still hungry." "What are you talking about?" I shouted, my voice cracking. Her eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. "They're already here." I looked. The shadows were inside the RV, filling the space behind me, their shapes twisting and writhing. In the end, I don't know how I got out. I remember sunlight, a clearing, the ranger station materializing out of nowhere. The shadows didn't follow me into the light, but their presence lingered like an itch at the back of my mind. I tried telling the rangers what happened, but they just exchanged knowing looks. "You're lucky," one of them said. "Most people don't make it out once they see them." "See what?" I demanded, though I already knew the answer. "The shadows," he said simply. "This place, it has a way of keeping people." I didn't stay to ask more questions. Months later, I can still feel them watching. In the dark corners of my apartment, in the spaces just outside the beam of my flashlight, they're there, waiting. We set off early that morning, the rising sun casting a golden sheen over the boundary waters. Carly was at the helm, as always, barking instructions and triple-checking our supplies while the rest of us loaded the canoes. She loved the wilderness and claimed it was her way of reconnecting with something primal. For me, Derek, it was a chance to hang out, drink beer by a campfire, and spend time with her. I didn't mind roughing it as long as the vibes stayed good. Amber, Carly's best friend, was in her element too. She loved kayaking and bragged about how she'd once done a solo trip through the Florida Everglades. Her brother Mark, on the other hand, looked as thrilled as a man headed to his own execution. He kept his head down, mumbling about his recent breakup, while the rest of us tried to keep the mood light. The first 2 days were uneventful. We paddled through calm waters, set up camp in a perfect clearing, and marveled at the raw beauty of the place. That first night, we laughed around the fire, joking about bears and swapping ghost stories. Carly rolled her eyes at my jokes, but I caught her smiling more than once. Amber roasted marshmallows while Mark mostly stared into the flames. But by the third night, things started to go wrong. It began with the storm. We'd set up camp on a small island, thinking the surrounding water would give us a break from mosquitoes. As we were unpacking, the sky darkened and a chill swept through the air. Rain came down in torrents, soaking us before we could secure the tents properly. Amber's tent leaked, leaving her gear waterlogged. She snapped at Carly, accusing her of choosing a bad campsite. Carly bit back, reminding Amber that she wasn't the one who'd ignored her advice to seal the seams. Tension brewed. By the time the rain stopped, we were all exhausted. Mark quietly repaired his own tent while I stayed by the fire with Carly, trying to cheer her up. That's when we smelled it. It hit me like a punch to the gut. A rancid, rotting stench, so strong it made me gag. Carly wrinkled her nose and waved a hand in front of her face. "What is that?" "Dead animal?" I guessed, though I didn't believe it. I'd smelled carrion before, but this was different. Sour and sharp, like spoiled meat left in the sun. Amber stepped out of her tent, wrinkling her nose. "What the hell is that smell?" No one could answer. It lingered all night, clinging to the damp air. The next day, we faced our first real setback. Our map, which Carly had painstakingly marked with our route, had gotten soaked during the storm. The ink bled, leaving the landmarks a smeared mess. Carly tried to salvage it, but we were left relying on a half-working GPS app. "This is why you bring backups," Amber muttered. "Not helpful," Carly snapped, stuffing the ruined map into her pack. Mark hung back, quietly paddling while the rest of us bickered about our direction. I tried to diffuse the tension with jokes, but no one was in the mood. By evening, we reached a new campsite, a quiet cove surrounded by thick trees. It should have been peaceful, but something about the place put me on edge. The air felt heavy, the silence too deep, like the forest was holding its breath. That night, I heard the footsteps. I woke to the sound of leaves crunching, slow and deliberate, circling the campsite. My first thought was a bear, but the steps didn't shuffle or snort like an animal would. They were measured, almost human. I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could, peering out into the darkness. The fire had died down to embers, casting faint light across the clearing. I could see shadows shifting just beyond the tree line. "Hello?" I whispered. No response. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, straining to listen. Then I heard it. A voice, faint and distant. "Derek?" My heart thudded in my chest. It sounded like Carly, but her voice was off, distorted like an old recording. I crawled back into the tent, pulling the sleeping bag over my head like a kid scared of monsters. The footsteps didn't return, but I didn't sleep. The next morning, I told Carly what I'd heard. "Footsteps," she repeated, frowning. "And a voice. It sounded like you, but weird." Amber scoffed. "Come on, Derek, it's the woods. Your brain was probably playing tricks on you." "I know what I heard," I insisted, but her smirk told me she wasn't convinced. Mark, however, looked pale. He pulled me aside while the others packed. "I heard it too," he said. "It wasn't Carly. It wasn't human." As the day went on, things got worse. We found a deer standing near the edge of the campsite, completely still. At first, I thought it was just startled, but it didn't move, even as we approached. Its eyes were glossy, almost human, and its body seemed gaunt, like it hadn't eaten in weeks. Carly clapped her hands, trying to scare it off, but it just turned and walked away, stiff and unnatural. "Okay, that was creepy," Amber admitted, her usual sarcasm absent. We decided to keep moving, hoping to find a safer spot. But by the time we reached the next campsite, we realized our food was missing. Despite tying the bear bag high in the trees, it had been shredded, the contents scattered and gone. "What the hell could have done this?" Carly muttered, examining the claw marks. "Something big," I said, feeling a shiver run down my spine. That night, Amber disappeared. We woke to find her tent empty, her gear untouched. Panic set in immediately. Carly wanted to search the woods, but Mark was hesitant. "She's gone," he said flatly, his voice trembling. "We can't save her." "What the hell is wrong with you?" Carly snapped. "We're not leaving her out there." But Mark's words struck a nerve. The fear in his eyes was contagious. Still, we couldn't leave her behind, so we followed the faint trail of footprints leading away from the campsite. We found her in a clearing, standing motionless, staring at something in the trees. "Amber!" Carly called, running toward her. Amber turned slowly, her face pale and streaked with tears. "It talked to me," she whispered. "It told me we're not getting out." "What are you talking about?" Carly demanded, grabbing her by the shoulders. Amber pointed to the trees. "That's when I saw it." The wendigo was taller than any human, its skeletal frame barely covered by taut, leathery skin. Antlers jutted from its head, and its eyes burned like embers in a hollow skull. It didn't move, but I felt its presence like a weight pressing down on my chest. "It's not real," Amber mumbled over and over as if trying to convince herself, but it was real, and it was watching us. The rest of the day was a blur. We stumbled back to the campsite, Amber muttering incoherently while Carly tried to plan our escape. Mark refused to leave the fire, claiming the darkness was safer than the trees. As night fell, the wendigo returned. It started with the voices. My voice, Carly's voice, Amber's voice. They echoed from the woods, distorted and mocking. Mark snapped first. He ran into the trees screaming, "Leave us alone!" We chased after him, but he was gone. His screams faded, replaced by a sickening silence. In the end, it was just me, Carly, and Amber. We paddled out at dawn, our canoe lurching with every stroke. The forest seemed to close in around us, the air heavy with that same rancid smell. When we reached the ranger station, we tried to explain what had happened, but the rangers didn't seem surprised. "The forest always takes its share," one of them said, almost like a prayer. Mark was never found. The trip was supposed to be simple. A few days of solitude in Colorado's Flatiron Lake campground to test out my new RV and see if the whole nomadic living thing suited me. After 42 years of 9-to-5 monotony and a divorce that left me reeling, I thought I deserved it. No schedules, no expectations, just me and the open road. The campground was even better than I'd imagined. Quiet, remote, with a serene lake surrounded by pine forests and jagged mountain peaks. Only a handful of other campers were parked nearby, most of them silent or out hiking. I pulled into my assigned spot, killed the engine, and stepped outside. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth. I stretched my legs, then started setting up camp. It didn't take long before I noticed how still the place was. The usual background noise of the outdoors, chirping birds, rustling leaves, seemed muted, like the forest was holding its breath. I shrugged it off. That was why I was here, wasn't it? To escape the chaos of the city. The first day was uneventful. I grilled some burgers, walked along the lake, and took a few pictures of the sunset. As night fell, I settled into the RV with a book and a beer. The quiet was comforting at first, but as the hours passed, it began to weigh on me. That's when I heard it. A faint knocking sound coming from underneath the RV. I froze, listening. The knock came again. 3 sharp taps like knuckles rapping against metal. I put down my book and opened the door, stepping into the cool night air. The stars were brilliant, but the forest was pitch black beyond the narrow beam of my flashlight. "Hello?" I called, feeling a little ridiculous. No response. I crouched and shone the light under the RV. The gravel was undisturbed, and the metal frame looked solid. No sign of wildlife either. No raccoons or porcupines scurrying away. Must have been the wind, I thought, though the air was perfectly still. The next morning, I decided to check out the abandoned mining settlement I'd read about online. It was a popular day hike from the campground, a relic from Colorado's gold rush era. I'm not usually one for tourist traps, but something about the ghost town intrigued me. The trail was quiet as I hiked, the only sound my boots crunching on dirt. About halfway there, the forest opened up into a clearing, and I saw the settlement, a cluster of rotting wooden shacks huddled at the base of a rocky hill. Most of the buildings had collapsed, but one structure still stood, a squat, windowless shack with a rusted tin roof. I walked toward it, curious. A strange feeling settled over me as I approached, like the air was thicker here, harder to breathe. Inside, the shack was empty except for a few broken tools and a pile of stones arranged in a rough circle on the floor. The stones were smooth and unnaturally uniform, as if they'd been polished by hand. Something about them felt wrong. I pulled out my phone and snapped a photo. As I did, the temperature seemed to drop, a sudden chill that prickled my skin. I left the shack quickly, my unease growing. Back at the RV, things started to feel off. The first thing I noticed was my keys. I'd left them on the counter by the sink, but now they were balanced on the edge of the bathroom sink, teetering precariously. I was sure I hadn't moved them. I chalked it up to exhaustion and sat down to eat. But as I opened a bottle of water, a loud thud echoed from the back of the RV. Heart pounding, I grabbed the flashlight and walked toward the noise. The bathroom door was ajar, though I knew I'd closed it earlier. Inside, the mirror was fogged over, even though the temperature was mild. And there, in the condensation, was a single word written in jagged letters, "Stay." I stumbled back, my chest tightening. My rational mind fought to explain it. A prank, maybe? Condensation patterns? But there was no one else around. That night, the knocking returned. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when the sound started again. Sharp, deliberate taps from underneath the RV. I stayed frozen, every muscle tensed. "Is someone there?" I called, my voice shaky. The knocking stopped, replaced by faint laughter. High-pitched and distant, it echoed through the forest like a child's giggle carried on the wind. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I decided to leave. Whatever was going on, I wasn't sticking around to find out. I packed up quickly, tossing my gear into the RV. When I slid into the driver's seat and turned the key, the engine sputtered and died. "Come on," I muttered, trying again. The RV let out a pitiful groan but refused to start. I stepped outside to check the engine. The wiring looked fine at first glance, but as I leaned closer, I noticed something strange. Several wires had been cleanly frayed, as though chewed by tiny teeth. I tried the ignition one more time, but the RV remained dead. Frustrated, I decided to walk to the main road for help. But as I started down the trail, the forest seemed different. The trees loomed closer, their branches knitting together to block out the sky. The dirt path felt unfamiliar, even though I'd walked it twice before. And no matter how far I went, I kept ending up back at the campground. That night, the spirits grew bolder. I built a fire, hoping it would keep the unease at bay, but the shadows around me seemed to deepen, swallowing the light. As I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, I felt it, a presence watching me. I turned slowly, and there it was, a figure standing at the edge of the forest, just beyond the firelight. It was small, no taller than my waist, and its silhouette was blurry, like smoke caught in the shape of a person. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the fire's light. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move. Then, from behind me, I heard a voice, a whisper, soft and mocking. "Ryan." I spun around, but no one was there. When I turned back, the figure had vanished. Desperate for answers, I pulled out my phone and searched for information about the mining settlement. A weak signal flickered in and out, but I managed to find an article about the area's history. The settlers who built the mine were Cornish immigrants, and they brought with them the legend of the Tommyknockers, mischievous spirits said to haunt mines and tunnels. The article described them as pranksters at best, but vengeful and territorial if disturbed. My stomach sank as I thought of the stone circle in the shack. I needed to make amends. Gathering every shiny object I could find, coins, keys, a pocket knife, I placed them in a small pile outside the RV. According to the article, Tommyknockers were said to be appeased by offerings of food or trinkets. I lit a candle beside the pile and waited, my heart pounding. The forest was silent, the air heavy with anticipation. Then the knocking began again, this time louder, coming from all sides of the RV. The fire flickered, and I saw them. Small, shadowy figures darting between the trees, their glowing eyes fixed on me. I grabbed the flashlight and shouted, "Take it! Take the offering and leave me alone!" For a moment, the figures hesitated. Then, one by one, they disappeared, melting into the shadows. By dawn, the forest felt lighter, less oppressive. When I tried the RV's engine, it roared to life without hesitation. I drove away without looking back, but as I reached the main road, I heard it. A single knock from underneath the RV. And then faint laughter. There's something unnervingly quiet about the desert. The vast emptiness seems peaceful at first, but the silence eventually turns heavy, like a weight pressing against your chest. That's why I chose it. I needed to breathe. My RV rolled into the campground just as the sun began to sink behind the towering mesas, splashing orange and purple streaks across the sky. The place was as remote as I'd hoped. No cell service, no nearby campers, not even a ranger station. Just me, the sands, and the jagged silhouettes of the mesas cutting into the horizon. This trip was supposed to be my retreat. After my divorce, I'd spent too much time holed up in my apartment, pacing like a caged animal. Monument Valley, with its wide-open skies and promises of solitude, seemed like the perfect escape. The campground itself was bare bones. 3 gravel lots marked with faded wooden signs, a single fire pit, and a picnic table warped from years of sun exposure. I parked in the middle lot, set up my folding chair, and leaned back to watch the sunset. The silence should have been calming, but that first night it wasn't. The RV's generator sputtered to life as I flipped on the lights inside, setting up my little home for the night. I unpacked my food, a few books, and my camera, ready to document the beauty of the desert. I'd barely finished dinner when the first problem cropped up. The power flickered. The lights dimmed, came back on, and then cut out completely. I stepped outside to check the generator, but as soon as I opened the door, the night greeted me with a strange sound. Distant, high-pitched, like a woman screaming. I froze, listening. The scream came again, this time lower, angrier. It echoed off the mesas, making it impossible to pinpoint its source. Coyotes, I told myself. But I didn't believe it. I'd heard coyotes before. They didn't sound like that. I woke early the next morning, determined to shake off the unease from the night before. The desert was beautiful in the daylight, the mesas casting long shadows over the red sand. After breakfast, I set out on foot to explore. I'd read about a few trails in the area, and though they weren't marked, the terrain was open enough to navigate without too much trouble. About an hour into my hike, I stumbled upon something unusual, a circle of stones half buried in the sand. They were smooth, unnaturally so, and arranged with precise symmetry. In the center lay a scattering of bones, small, animal, maybe birds. Curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped into the circle to take a closer look. The air felt heavier there, like stepping into a bubble of humidity despite the dry desert heat. I snapped a photo, then felt a sharp wave of nausea. I left the circle quickly, shaking off the strange sensation and chalking it up to dehydration. By the time I returned to the RV, the sun was high and the heat was oppressive. The generator wouldn't start. I cursed under my breath, fiddling with the wires and trying the ignition again, but nothing happened. The RV was dead. The lights, the fridge, the air conditioning, all of it gone. Sweat poured down my back as I sat in the driver's seat, staring at the empty road stretching back toward civilization. It was too far to walk, and there was no one else around to help. As night fell, the unease from the previous day returned, stronger than before. I built a small fire outside, hoping it would keep my mind off the isolation. But the desert's silence had changed. It wasn't just quiet. It was wrong. The usual sounds of the wilderness, crickets, the rustle of wind, the occasional howl of a distant coyote, were gone. Even the fire seemed muted, its crackle swallowed by the stillness. Then the screaming began again. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped away from the fire, scanning the darkness. The scream sounded closer this time, more desperate. My gut told me to stay put, but my curiosity, or maybe my stupidity, pushed me forward. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. The scream cut off abruptly, replaced by a faint whispering. It was too soft to make out, but the tone was unmistakable. Angry. As I swung the flashlight in a slow arc, the beam caught something in the distance. A figure standing on the edge of a mesa, silhouetted against the moonlit sky. I froze. "Hey!" I called. The figure didn't move. It was unnaturally still, almost statuesque. I took a step closer, then another. The beam of my flashlight flickered, and by the time it steadied, the figure was gone. I didn't sleep that night. Back inside the RV, I locked the doors and sat by the window, staring out at the fire pit. The shadows cast by the dying flames seemed to shift, forming shapes that disappeared as quickly as they appeared. Around 3 a.m., I heard the door creak. My heart stopped. I'd locked it. I was sure I had. I grabbed the nearest object, a wrench from the RV's toolbox, and stepped toward the door. It was open, swinging slightly in the breeze. The air inside was freezing, despite the stifling desert heat. On the floor, leading from the door to the back of the RV, were smeared tracks of dirt. They stopped abruptly in the middle of the space, as if whatever had entered had simply vanished. The next morning, I knew I couldn't stay. I packed what I could into a backpack and started walking, following the dirt road back toward the main highway. The RV was a lost cause, and I was desperate to escape the campground and whatever haunted it. But the desert was unforgiving. The sun beat down relentlessly, and the mesas seemed to shift, their shapes blending into one another until I couldn't tell where I was. As the day wore on, I realized with mountain dread that I wasn't getting closer to the highway. Somehow, I'd ended up back at the campground. That night, the entity revealed itself. I built another fire, hoping to keep whatever was out there at bay. But as the flames grew, the shadows surrounding the campground deepened. And then I saw it. It stepped out from the edge of the firelight, and its body shifted and translucent, like smoke trapped in the shape of a man. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, and its face, it was my face. The thing grinned, its expression twisted and unnatural. "Ethan," it rasped, its voice a distorted echo of my own. I stumbled back, clutching the wrench like a lifeline. The entity advanced, slow and deliberate, its form flickering like a flame in the wind. Desperate, I remembered the stone circle. I grabbed my flashlight and ran, the entity following close behind. Its growls filled the air, low and guttural, vibrating in my chest. When I reached the circle, I fell to my knees and fumbled through my backpack for the small bundle of sage I'd packed, a nod to my half-hearted interest in folklore. I lit the sage and waved it over the circle, chanting the first thing that came to mind: "Leave me alone." The entity stopped at the edge of the stones, its form writhing as though in pain. For a moment, I thought it would retreat, but then it lunged. I woke at dawn, sprawled on the edge of the circle. The entity was gone, but its presence lingered, a heavy weight pressing down on the desert air. I stumbled back to the campground, my body aching and my throat raw. Park rangers found me later that day, dehydrated and delirious. I told them about the RV, the screaming, the entity. They dismissed it as heat stroke-induced hallucinations, but when I reviewed the photos on my camera back home, one image stood out. It was a picture of the stone circle, and in the background, standing just behind me, was the shadowy form of the entity. Its eyes glowed yellow. When I first heard about the Brown Mountain Lights, I was skeptical. Ghosts, swamp gas, ball lightning, none of it sounded real. But for someone like me, an amateur videographer chasing thrills for my travel channel, it was the perfect story. I'd quit my desk job a month ago to live in my RV and document America's strangest places, and the Pine Barrens, the Winchester House, and now the Brown Mountain Lights were all on my list. So, there I was, parked at a remote campsite near Brown Mountain, North Carolina, with a perfect view of the dark ridge rising against the twilight sky. I had everything set. My drone, camera, and laptop ready to capture whatever phenomenon I could. The first night was uneventful, just crickets chirping and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. I stayed up late, hoping to catch a glimpse of the famous orbs, but nothing happened. Then, at around 2 a.m., the lights appeared. I was sitting in the RV, scrolling through old footage, when I saw them through the window. Small, bobbing orbs of light hovering above the treetops. At first, I thought they might be drones, but they moved too erratically, darting back and forth in patterns that seemed almost alive. Grabbing my camera, I rushed outside, shivering in the cool mountain air. The lights were faint, but they pulsed in a mesmerizing rhythm, like they were calling to me. I started filming, whispering commentary for the video. "There they are," I said, the camera shaking in my hands. "The Brown Mountain Lights. They're real." For about 10 minutes, they danced silently in the distance before fading away. I stood there in the dark, exhilarated. But when I went back inside, things started to go wrong. The first sign was my drone. I powered it up to check the footage, but the screen was a mess of static. The battery, fully charged just hours ago, was drained to almost nothing. My laptop wasn't much better, the screen flickering with strange symbols I didn't recognize. I stared at them, trying to make sense of it, but the patterns seemed to twist and shift the longer I looked. "Great," I muttered, shutting the laptop. "Tech issues on night one." I went to bed, frustrated, hoping for a better start in the morning. The next day, I decided to explore the area. There was an old trail leading up the mountain, and I figured a higher vantage point might give me a better shot of the lights. The hike was tougher than I expected. Loose rocks and overgrown roots made every step a challenge. Halfway up, I slipped, my ankle twisting painfully as I fell against a jagged rock. Wincing, I brushed myself off and kept going, stubbornness outweighing common sense. By the time I reached the summit, I was sweaty, bruised, and in a foul mood. But the view was worth it. The whole valley stretched out below, the trees like a sea of green beneath the blue sky. I set up my camera, taking a few shots before heading back down. That's when I noticed the first strange thing. I couldn't find the trail. I retraced my steps, scanning the ground for the path I'd followed up, but it was gone. The terrain looked unfamiliar, the trees leaning at odd angles, as if the forest had shifted while I wasn't looking. Panic crept in. I checked my phone for GPS, but there was no signal. I stood there, turning in circles, until I spotted something out of the corner of my eye, a faint glow between the trees. The lights. They were closer this time, brighter, hovering just above the ground. Without thinking, I started walking toward them, stumbling over roots and rocks. They moved as I approached, pulling me deeper into the forest. As I followed, the world around me seemed to change. The trees grew taller, their branches twisting unnaturally. The air felt heavy, almost electric, and my watch wasn't working. The lights vanished as suddenly as they'd appeared, leaving me alone in the darkening woods. That's when I noticed the time. 3 hours had passed. It didn't make sense. I'd only been hiking for 20 minutes, maybe 30 at most, but somehow it was already evening. My stomach twisted as I limped back toward what I hoped was the campsite. When I finally reached the RV, the sun was setting. My ankle throbbed, my clothes were torn, and my nerves were shot. I needed answers, but I also needed sleep. The second night was worse. I woke to a strange humming sound, low and resonant, vibrating through the walls of the RV. At first, I thought it was some kind of mechanical issue, but when I stepped outside, the noise was coming from the woods. The lights were back. This time, they weren't in the distance. They were right there, hovering just beyond the edge of the clearing. They were larger now, brighter, and they moved with purpose, circling the RV in slow, deliberate patterns. I grabbed my drone, determined to get close enough to see what they really were. But the moment the drone lifted into the air, the lights scattered, darting away faster than the camera could track. The drone's screen flickered, the controls became unresponsive, and it crashed into the trees with a sickening crunch. Then I saw them, figures. At first I thought they were people, pale shapes moving between the trees. But as I squinted, I realized something was wrong. They were too tall, too thin, their limbs bending in ways that didn't seem possible. I called out, my voice shaking. "Hello? Who's there?" The figures stopped. One of them turned, its face, or what should have been a face, completely smooth, like a mannequin. It tilted its head, as if studying me, before fading into the shadows. The lights flared, brighter than ever, forcing me to shield my eyes. When I looked again, the figures were gone. By the third day, I was unraveling. My gear was useless, my footage corrupted, and I hadn't slept more than a few hours. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the lights. I couldn't leave, not with my RV acting up, and even if I could, I wasn't sure I wanted to. I needed to know what was happening. That night, I set up a perimeter of flashlights around the campsite, hoping to keep the lights at bay. But they came anyway, piercing through the trees like ghostly fireflies. They moved closer and closer still until they were just a few feet away. Their hum grew louder, the ground beneath me vibrating with each pulse. And then they stopped. For a moment, the world was silent. Then came the voice. "Lucas," it said. It was my own voice. I stumbled backward, my chest tight with fear. The lights pulsed, brighter and faster, their hum rising to a deafening pitch. The air seemed to warp around me, the edges of the RV shimmering like a mirage. Before I could react, the light surged forward, surrounding me in a blinding haze. I felt weightless, as if the ground had vanished beneath my feet. And then I was somewhere else. The forest was gone, replaced by an endless expanse of glowing orbs, floating in a vast, starless void. Towering structures rose in the distance, their surfaces smooth and reflective, like liquid metal. I saw shapes moving within the orbs, humanoid forms, their faces frozen in expressions of fear and agony. One of them turned to me. I don't remember how I got back to the RV. The next thing I knew, I was driving down the mountain, my hands shaking on the wheel. The lights didn't follow, but their hum echoed in my ears even as I reached the main road. When I finally stopped to catch my breath, I noticed something on my arm. A faint burn mark, circular, with a pattern that looked disturbingly like the lights. I've tried to forget what happened on Brown Mountain, but I can't. The footage is gone, corrupted beyond repair, but the memories remain, along with the mark. Sometimes, late at night, I see faint orbs outside my window, and I wonder if they've come back for me. I hope they never do. It wasn't the first time I'd gone camping alone. After the divorce, solo trips had become my thing, a way to clear my head, escape the suffocating silence of my apartment, and remind myself I could survive on my own. But something about this trip to the Pine Barrens was different. I felt it the moment I turned off the main road and onto the sand-strewn trail that led to my campsite. The forest seemed alive, oppressive. The towering pines loomed overhead, their branches interlocking to block out the sun. Even my RV seemed out of place here, like it didn't belong. This is what you wanted, I told myself as I parked in a small clearing near an abandoned village I'd read about online. My goal was to spend a few days photographing the ruins, immersing myself in the history of the Pine Barrens, and maybe confronting some of my own ghosts. The storm rolled in that first night. I'd just finished setting up camp, the smell of instant coffee still lingering in the RV, when thunder cracked overhead. Rain came in sheets, drumming against the metal roof and turning the trail outside into a river of mud. It wasn't until the middle of the night that I heard it. A distant, high-pitched scream. At first, I thought it was an animal. Foxes make that kind of sound, don't they? But something about it was wrong. It wasn't just the pitch, it was the way it seemed to carry through the trees, echoing like a voice in a cavern. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, telling myself it was nothing. But I didn't sleep. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the forest cloaked in mist. The trail was slick, and the RV's tires had sunk into the soft sand. It took me hours to dig it out, my muscles screaming from the effort. By the time I finished, I was drenched in sweat and cursing myself for coming here. Then I noticed it. Hoof prints in the mud around the RV. They were large, too large to belong to any deer or horse, and strangely deep, as though whatever made them weighed far more than it should. They circled the vehicle, crisscrossing back and forth before disappearing into the woods. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was some kind of prank. This was Jersey after all. People loved to keep the legend of the Jersey Devil alive. Still, unease crept into my gut as I grabbed my camera and headed toward the abandoned village. The village was more ruin than settlement. A few crumbling stone foundations, the rotting remains of a wooden cabin, and an old well choked with moss. The place felt forgotten, consumed by the forest. As I snapped photos, the silence pressed down on me. No birds, no insects, not even the rustle of leaves in the wind. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I was crouched by the well, adjusting the focus on my camera, when I heard my name. "Ethan!" I froze. It was faint, barely more than a whisper, but unmistakable. Someone, or something, had said my name. "Hello?" I called, scanning the trees. Nothing moved. "Get a grip," I muttered, shaking my head. But my hands were trembling as I packed up my gear and hurried back to the RV. That night, the noises started again. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard the first thud against the RV's wall. It wasn't loud, more like a soft knock, but it was deliberate. "Probably a tree branch," I said to myself, though my voice sounded thin and unconvincing. The second knock came from the opposite side of the RV, then another, closer this time. I grabbed my flashlight and threw open the curtain. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but trees and shadows. And then the scratching began. It was slow, deliberate, nails dragging down metal. My chest tightened as I moved to the door, my flashlight trembling in my hand. When I opened it, the noise stopped. The forest was silent again, as if mocking me. But I could feel it. Something was out there, watching. The next morning, I found claw marks gouged into the side of the RV. They were deep, jagged, and far too large to be from any animal I knew. Worse, small items inside the RV had gone missing. My lighter, a flashlight, even my notebook. It didn't make sense. The doors had been locked all night. I wanted to leave, but when I tried to start the RV, the engine sputtered and died. I checked the battery, the fuel gauge, everything seemed fine, but it wouldn't turn over. Panic began to claw at the edges of my mind. I grabbed my backpack, loaded it with supplies, and decided to hike back toward the main road. Maybe I could flag down help. The trail was harder to follow than I'd expected. The rain had washed much of it away, and the dense trees all looked the same. That's when I noticed the footprints. They weren't mine. They were hoof-like, the same as the ones I'd seen around the RV, but these were fresh. They seemed to follow me, weaving between the trees. And they weren't alone. Beside them, I saw handprints, elongated fingers pressed into the damp earth. By the time I got back to the RV, the sun was setting. The hoof prints circled the vehicle again, deeper now, as if something had been pacing impatiently. I locked the doors and tried to calm myself, but the whispers started before long. "Ethan," a voice called, soft and feminine. It sounded like her, Jessica. My stomach lurched. I knew it couldn't be her, but the sound of her voice, so familiar, so close, made my resolve falter. "Ethan," it said again from just outside the door. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay inside. Then came the crash. The RV shook violently, the walls reverberating as if something massive had thrown itself against it. The lights flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. I don't know what possessed me to open the door, but I did. The forest was alive with movement. Shadows darted between the trees, too fast and too large to be human. My flashlight caught glimpses of something winged, its form shifting as it moved. And then I saw it. It stood at the edge of the clearing, its eyes glowing red in the darkness. It was grotesque, a nightmare given form. Goat-like hooves, leathery wings, and a twisted, elongated face. The Jersey Devil. I slammed the door shut, my heart hammering in my chest. The RV shook again, the creature slamming into it with inhuman strength. I grabbed a knife from the kitchenette and backed into the corner, waiting for it to break through. But then, as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the corner, knife in hand. When the first light of dawn filtered through the windows, I forced myself to move. The RV's engine miraculously started, and I didn't question it. I just drove, not stopping until I was miles away from the forest. As I reached the main road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The creature was there, perched on a distant tree, its glowing eyes locked on me. Even now, weeks later, I can't shake the feeling that it's still watching, waiting. I don't know if I escaped that forest or if some part of me is still trapped there, lost in the shadows. All I know is I'll never go back. I've always thought of myself as practical, a problem solver, someone who doesn't buy into ghost stories or superstition. But what happened in Shenandoah changed all of that. The shadows I saw, what they did to us, are burned into my mind like a brand. It started as a simple trip. Sam, Claire, and I had been planning this RV adventure for months. After my breakup with Jessica, I needed a distraction, something to get me out of my own head. Claire, who's always had a thing for folklore and spooky places, suggested Shenandoah National Park, and Sam, ever the opportunist, figured he could film some content for his travel vlog. We parked the RV at a remote site off Skyline Drive, surrounded by towering hardwoods and dense, misty forest. The kind of spot that feels both serene and unnerving, like the trees themselves are watching. Cell service was non-existent, but we didn't care. Disconnecting was the whole point, right? By dusk, we'd set up camp and were sitting around a small fire, the light flickering off the shadows of the trees. "You know this place is haunted, right?" Claire said, smirking over her mug of tea. Sam leaned forward, his eyes wide with mock horror. "Oh no, Claire. Don't tell me the ghost stories are starting already." "Not ghost stories," she corrected. "Legends, shadow people. They're supposed to stalk hikers around here. Watchers, some people call them. You don't notice them at first, but once you do, it's too late." I snorted. "Sounds like a load of crap to me." Claire just shrugged. "You'll see." We laughed it off, but as the fire died down and the darkness closed in, her words lingered in my mind. That night, I woke to the sound of whispering. At first, I thought it was Sam and Claire talking in the kitchen area of the RV, but when I looked, they were both asleep. The whispering wasn't coming from inside, it was outside, low and indistinct, like dozens of voices just out of earshot. I told myself it was the wind and rolled over, but my heart was racing. In the morning, I found Claire sitting on a boulder near the RV, her camera in hand. "You okay?" I asked, pouring myself a cup of coffee. She glanced at me, her brow furrowed. "Did you hear anything last night?" "Probably just animals," I said, though I didn't entirely believe it myself. Claire didn't look convinced. We decided to hike a nearby trail that day. Claire insisted on bringing her camera, and Sam hauled his gear, hoping to catch some interesting shots for his vlog. The woods were beautiful, but quiet. Too quiet. An hour in, I noticed Claire lagging behind. "Come on, slowpoke," I called. She frowned. "Did you just call me?" "What?" "You called my name. I heard you." I shook my head. "No, I didn't." Her face paled, but she didn't say anything else. About 20 minutes later, I heard it too. Claire's voice calling my name. I spun around, but she was right behind me, fiddling with her camera strap. "What?" she asked, noticing my look. You didn't just say my name?" "No." The hair on the back of my neck stood up. By the time we got back to the RV, the tension between us was palpable. Sam tried to lighten the mood by joking about the creepy forest and how Claire's stories were getting into my head, but even he seemed on edge. The real trouble started that night. It was late, the forest around us pitch black. I'd just climbed into my sleeping bag when I heard the snapping of twigs outside. "Sam," I whispered, "did you hear that?" "Probably a deer," he muttered, half asleep. But then the scratching started. A slow, deliberate sound like nails running down the side of the RV. Claire sat bolt upright, her face pale in the dim light. "What the hell is that?" she whispered. I grabbed a flashlight and edged toward the window. My hand trembled as I pulled back the curtain. Nothing. The scratching stopped, but the sense of being watched didn't. The next morning, we found smudges on the windows, handprints too large and distorted to be human. "We're leaving," Claire said, her voice trembling. "Don't be ridiculous," I said. "It's probably just some pranksters." Sam was unusually quiet, his camera clutched tightly in his hands. When we tried to start the RV, the engine sputtered and died. "What's wrong with it?" Claire asked, panic creeping into her voice. "I don't know," I admitted, checking the battery and fuel gauge. Everything looked fine, but the damn thing wouldn't start. By dusk, the whispering returned, louder this time. It came from all around us, a low, guttural murmur that seemed to vibrate in my chest. "Alex," a voice called, eerily like Claire's, "come outside." "Don't!" Claire hissed, gripping my arm. "Don't listen to it!" The shadows outside grew darker, denser, and began moving. Long, distorted figures gliding between the trees. Sam aimed his camera at them, his hands shaking. "Do you see that?" he whispered. "Yeah," I said, my throat dry. The shadows moved closer, their forms stretching and twisting unnaturally. That night was the worst. The shadows surrounded the RV, slamming against the walls and rattling the doors. Sam, desperate to document the chaos, flung the door open with his camera in hand. "Sam, no!" Claire screamed, but it was too late. A shadowy figure surged forward, wrapping its elongated limbs around him. He screamed, his camera dropping to the ground as he was dragged into the woods. I grabbed a flashlight and a hatchet, my heart pounding. We have to get him." Claire nodded, though she was trembling. We followed the sound of Sam's screams through the woods, the flashlight beam barely cutting through the suffocating darkness. The shadows were everywhere, flitting just out of reach. We found him near an ancient tree covered in strange symbols. He was unconscious but breathing, his face pale and his body limp. The shadows circled us, growing bolder, their forms becoming more defined. "They don't like fire," Claire whispered suddenly. "Light the torch." I grabbed a stick and lit it with my lighter, waving the flames toward the shadows. They recoiled, hissing like steam escaping a kettle. "Go!" I shouted, dragging Sam as Claire held the torch. Back at the RV, we managed to get the engine running, though I still don't know how. The shadows didn't follow us onto the open road, but the feeling of being watched never left. Sam wouldn't talk about what happened. He just sat in the back, staring blankly out the window. As we drove away, I caught a glimpse of the shadows in the rearview mirror, standing at the edge of the trees, watching us go. We survived Shenandoah, but none of us came out unscathed. Claire refuses to hike anymore, and Sam quit his vlog. As for me, I can't step into a forest without feeling their eyes on me. The shadows are still out there, waiting, and I'll never go back.